This amendment, like the previous amendment, is simple but very important. We heard the discussion from Mr. McNerney and supporters of his amendment about the water hyacinth and the endangered or the invasive species that have plagued not just the California Delta but other parts of the West. Important. This amendment is also an important amendment, small but important. It deals with a way of providing a fish screen on the Delta cross channels, a very important element in the California water system. Why this hasn't been done before, I don't know. I live within a mile of the Delta cross channels, and I've often wondered why the agencies have not pursued a fish screen. They have to close the channel gates when the fish are in the river, and thereby providing less water through the Delta. So this would simply move it along. And these two amendments are an example of what we ought to be doing. Mr. McNerney and I represent the Delta, 700,000 acres, equal in size to the area that are the principal proponents of the underlying legislation, that is the Westlands Water District. Both important, both critical agricultural areas, both of which need water. The underlying legislation ignores the environmental needs and the agricultural needs of the Delta and simply provide, not simply, but in a very complex way, provide a mechanism to take water out of the Delta without regard to either the environmental or the agriculture or the community needs in the area. It's not going to pass. It should never become law. And it is an example of how not to solve California water problems. The way you solve California water problems are with amendments such as Mr. McNerney's or this amendment that I'm putting forth, and serious discussions between those of us that represent the Delta. Now, I'd also like to point out to my colleagues who are proponents of this bill that I represent 200 miles of the Sacramento River from the very end of it, that is at San Francisco Bay, to an area 199.6 miles upriver, including virtually all of the rice industry of California, of which there are some 600,000 acres, and nearly half of that acreage is fallowed this year. So the drought isn't just about the impact on the San Joaquin Valley system, with which we've heard much debate this morning. It's also about the Sacramento Valley, north of the Delta, in which the drought has had a major impact. California needs to work together in the immediate situation, which it is actually doing. The federal and state governments, water policy, through the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife agencies, both state and federal government, have done a yeoman's work, have done extraordinary work at stretching the water supplies of California. This bill would override that effort and make it impossible for them to continue. God help us if the drought goes another year. It could, in which case, if this bill were to become law, all that has been done in California over this last 3 years to stretch the water supplies would be pushed aside. We shouldn't do it that way. We should be working together. Mr. Huffman has a good piece of legislation that has already achieved statewide support from water contractors, from those who understand the intricacies of this system. We could do it if we sat down together, and that has not happened. For those of us that represent the Delta and the north of the Delta, we find this to be objectionable, and we find it to be rather foolish. There is a middle ground. But don't, as this bill does, push aside the environmental laws, which are the only protections for the largest estuary system on the west coast of the Western Hemisphere. Don't do that. Why would you destroy the salmon fisheries? Why would you destroy 700,000 acres and the water supplies for the Bay Area? You shouldn't do that. You don't need to do that. There are rational and reasonable ways to solve the California water problem. Some of it is in this bill. The storage systems, good, well done. But don't do that in a way that pushes aside the environmental protections that provide the balance, not just for the environment, for the communities that are affected. Don't do that. We can work together. Just give us a chance to do so, which you have not thus far done. Having no more time, I suppose, I must yield back.
Gentleman's time is